things you have to observe. I mean, it's unbelievable. They're making it horribly difficult on us. But all this assessment has to be done by like November 30th. So I don't know how it's really predicting kindergarten readiness, because we're going to be through the first 9 weeks by the time it gets done.
And I truly fear for you based on what I've heard from some folks. And
Yeah.
I
Christy and I have been pushing issues big time.
I'm really worried for you guys.
It doesn't look very pretty or promising, and these poor ladies that are presenting it to us, we were kind of a little bit on edge about it. And I mean, it's crazy because you're telling us we have to do all these things, but no one has it done. So we'll see how it works.
Yeah, and well, that's what I said. I mean, this idea, we're moving so far away from authentic assessment that and it's so high stakes.
Yeah.
And we're making they're making budget decisions. It is really concerning. And it's really scary.
Yes, it
is. Okay. So I'm going to talk through this. I've got the recording, and there's a couple of these slides that I'm going to not spend a whole lot of time on. But basically, what your task is with this information this week is to think about the child that you've selected, and if you don't have any information on what we call gifts and contributions from either a family perspective or somebody that they have a relationship with in a program, and interest and preferences, that's one thing that's one of our tasks, is to really think about what is the strength-based approach that I can use as I start to think about offering instruction or interventions in areas that are more of a challenge or are going to possibly not be a preference. So the one thing is to think about, I'm going to share this, and I don't think I got it posted on the website yet, but I'm going to share this Reach for the Stars, which is a way to kind of organize this strength-based information from a family or from a teacher setting. And then the second thing I'm going to show you is just this, the curriculum framework approach to thinking about this tiering of outcomes, tiering of interventions for young children. So this presentation that I'm going to kind of zoom through is actually one that Christy Preddy-Franzek brought to my agency this year and shared with all of our intermediate agency support. So our school psychs or special education reps that serve preschools, our speech language paths that serve preschools, and then all of our early childhood consultants got this kind of same message. And then we in turn, over the next 4 months, once a month, kind of rolled out this idea of how to scaffold and tier for children with all of our teachers. So the first thing that she starts with is just this nice idea of what's coming at us in education. And she has the cake there because she talks about there's lots of tiering happening these days in education. The triangle is actually her graphic that was included in the white paper on response to intervention in early childhood. The umbrella is actually one of the symbols for this overarching connections in the curriculum framework. And then she's just got some authentic images of children and this database decision-making process. And then the one down in the very corner is this idea of least to most adult support based on the child's needs. So that's something that we're going to look at next week. But lo and behold, Danielle, so these are two of her favorite friends, and that she features them in some of our supports. And just this idea to think about gifts and contributions that we are really thinking about day-to-day, moment-to-moment support for success, building and fostering these talents, and avoiding this deficit-based emphasis or model. And this quote from Pianta and Cox that readiness is not actually a trait. Readiness is just an adjective for talking about the process, and it all stems back to really scaffolding and meeting individual child needs. And everybody has gifts and contributions that they bring to the table. So in this curriculum framework support, this is kind of a nice thing to think about what it is and what it isn't. And so when we talk, we need to think about connections across our assessment, the objectives that are being either handed to us or that we have personal commitment to for children, which we talk about the scope of the learning for the child, the activities that we're going to be using and how those connect back to the assessments and back to the objectives, and then progress monitoring. And so what's really nice about this kind of framework is it keeps it squarely connected. And she talks about when you think about each of these, this ASAP, assessment, scope, activities, and progress monitoring, and you think about those components of an umbrella, we need to make sure that they're even and balanced. And I really appreciate that statement, because if what I think happens is assessment in that 4 parts of the umbrella right now seems to be like weighted down. It feels like all of our emphasis is on conducting assessment to the point where we don't even really get to interpret assessment, because we're assessing so frequently with such intensity that we really can't step back and even interpret and determine next steps. So these are all of the things that the curriculum framework can do. And then she kind of also gives some real specifics on it's not the only way. There's other instructional educational supports out there. It's not containable. It's very much a process, and it's ebbs and flows. It's not about special education only. It's not simple, but it is logical. It's not just a curriculum, so it's not like a basal reader that you turn the page. It just gives us some supports for making decisions. So here, if they would hand you, Danielle, a kindergarten readiness assessment that actually could give us insight and predictions for some of these, what a school-ready child actually looks like, the traits that they actually bring and the ones that we want to foster. I think that's right now the dilemma. That's right now we have 2 different masters, 2 different groups kind of pushing at us. What are the skills and traits and attributes of a child? What does school readiness really look like? And then you compound that with what do we want the 21st century learner to look like? And we get all of this coming at us. But generally, when I talk to preschool teachers, kindergarten teachers, and home interventionists and say, what is it that what are your hopes and dreams for these children? These are the type of words that pop up. I'm going to stop a little bit and just let you respond to that, Danielle, after you just were kind of thinking about, maybe you could share this slide with your school readiness presenters.
Mm-hmm. You broke up a little bit. Oh, Pam?
Oh, am I?
Yeah, you broke up a little bit there. What did you say, the last part? We could share it with.
Share it with your school readiness people.
Sorry, say it again, one more time.
I said maybe you can share it with your school readiness people.
Yes.
How does this align with what they shared, what school readiness looks like?
Oh, I can tell you it doesn't.
But that's a question you can always ask to say, hey, this is from 0 to 3 and their vision. How does this align with what we see our vision of school readiness looks like?
Yeah. It's really not like this at all.
Scary too. How do we influence that? That's my question.
Well, it doesn't, they say that they're taking all this input from all these educators, but the funny part about it is that they already had it pretty much developed and they're already going through the stages, and then they're taking the teachers, critiques. I'm like, is it really even going to matter? That's my biggest thing. They have all these teachers helping out and doing all of these, pilot programs, but I don't see how it's even going to affect what the test looks like, because it sounds like they have it all created already. So we'll see how it all goes. I'm pretty much the person that just doesn't worry about it until it's thrown at me. So, because I really can't do anything about it but make it the best I can, So we'll see. It doesn't sound very hopeful.
Yeah. I would put these types of words in front of them, though, and say, these are the things that I really value as children coming in. I can get to concept development with materials and with repetition, but these are the things that I need to be supported, and these are the things that I really need the message I need to go to families and preschool practitioners. But yeah, I don't think you're going to see a lot of these types of things.
Yeah.
So again, the curriculum framework is that ASAP acronym is how we remember it. And assessment in this framework is really ongoing and intended to be formative assessment, and is different than this idea of monitoring performance or progress over time. So they initially, now this is morphing a bit, but they initially were wanted to keep them very clear and separate, that there was pieces that you could do for like evaluation, for screeners, and that assessment has limitations, and that's when performance monitoring kicks in, when we really need to get thinking about more frequently, get more targeted information that we are seeing gains and growth. So in the curriculum framework, they do tease those two pieces apart. And I will say that in the K to 6 world, that performance monitoring piece is the piece where we kind of fall flat. We, like I said, in our world, we're getting some performance monitoring support for rate. There's not really anything out there yet for vocabulary or comprehension. Here's another thing you can share with the kindergarten readiness people. You can just take this whole PowerPoint and share it with them.
Yeah.
Well, I actually think Christy is meeting with ODE on this very issue.
I think she is too, because I saw a little piece of the math stuff.
I was asked to give input on good assessment. So Ashley Lyons and Michelle and I created 5 slides for quality family interviewing, what that looks like, what it is, and interviewing peers too. So I think they've stopped the boat because they realized they missed the boat a little bit. And so I don't know if they'll change the system or they'll change the training. But I know Christy's trying to influence the training with them.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
But this is one of those things, this is when early learning standards get out of control, when we try to list everything that we think is important. And this is when assessments get too much priority, when we think that we need to measure everything that counts. This is my real concern with right now National Core, because there are just this unmanageable amount of indicators that are not sequenced across a developmental year. And now people are throwing around terms like standards-based measures and standards-based outcomes. And what I'm worried is that somebody's going to think that every single Common Core indicator is going to need to be some type of test. So that's my concern, is that early learning standards don't fully demonstrate everything that we value and teach, and assessments definitely can't do that. This is another one of Christy's favorite quotes, that misrepresenting children through mismeasurement denies them their rights to beneficial expectations and opportunities. And there's a lot of high stakes outcomes right now for this idea of single tests and what we do with that. A good friend of mine who's a principal in Ohio, she said, especially with this teacher, the teacher evaluation system linked to child outcomes, one of her favorite quotes is, yeah, because I want my job security to be based on a hormonal 14-year-old who has ADHD. You know, I mean, she's like, that's how I want to be evaluated for if I get to have retention or not. So, you know, there's just a lot going on and a lot of pressures, and a lot of people are looking to assessment for the answers and the solutions. Here's another one. This is what I felt this morning. Because I walked into the meeting and I said, I just need to connect a child with a program. That's all I need. I need a space for this 3-year-old in your blended program next year, and I need you to figure out how to fund it. So now I kind of feel that we are having to go through the data collection just because of an administrative requirement, because of a programmatic requirement, and because, and I actually said this morning, it feels unethical what we're doing to this little boy. Bringing him into a strange place, pulling him away from his dad, which we already know is going to be disastrous, surrounding him with a team of testers, and just to get him in the door for his first day of preschool, that feels unethical to me.
And the data won't be accurate, period.
Well, I'm not even sure that with this kid that we're going to get accurate data until we really build a relationship. I mean, yeah.
Right. It's not appropriate. You're going to give this parent information about deficits in their child without seeing the child function in their comfortable, natural locations. And it may not be different, but you haven't given that child an opportunity to prove it one way or the other.
So this, we come back to what do we need together? And Christy actually did this piece that said that the Latin derivative of assessment is, now I can't remember how you pronounce it, but it basically means sit beside and get to know. And so how different would our world be if anytime we decided we needed to assess, all that looked like was sit beside and get to know. And I actually have tried this year. Instead of walking in with a checklist, instead of walking in with some type of assessment tool, instead of walking in with a camera and a notebook and a clipboard, I've really just tried to build a relationship with whoever it is I've been asked to support in a sit beside and get to know. It drives teachers crazy that they finally get me in the room with this kid that's just been, you know, off the wall, and they'll say, what do you need? And I say, I just need to go play for a little bit. But basically what I find myself asking anytime I get a referral for Child Find, pretty regularly now is, what are their strengths, what are their interests, and what are their preferences? And actually, that's going to be my interview with this family tomorrow, because I need to have those interests and preferences in mind to do anything with this little boy in this assessment situation. So those 3 things, again, are what I'm going to ask you guys to go out and gather some information on in a sit beside and get to know. Now, sit beside and get to know might be also sitting beside and getting to know the families and the adults that are in the primary service role. But regardless, we want to hold true to those authentic assessment practices whenever possible. And I would like to say always, familiar settings, familiar people doing familiar things. So especially when we're gathering this tier 1 information, and this idea of in a home setting, while I'm playing, while I'm eating, while I'm thinking, while I'm creating with familiar people, doing familiar things. So this idea of pull out, pull aside, or tabletop assessment, we want to try to think about meeting the child where they are versus bringing the assessment toolkit and our outcomes to the sit beside and get to know experience. What I am finding with this is it's extending my observational times. So we're making more progress, we're gaining more data, but it's really starting to extend the window of observation to try to figure out what's a goodness of fit. Some of you are going to be familiar with the APS, and that's going to be fine if you want to rely on that on helping to define those tier 1 outcomes. Some of you are going to be familiar with the GOLD. We also have the developmental checklist from when we were looking at developmental sequences. And for a screening tool, not a curriculum-based assessment, but for an initial conversation starter, or just to start to think about functional outcomes that are relevant and essential, we also have the ages and stages and the ages and stages social-emotional. Little different type of information and assessment than a curriculum-based, but for this assignment, it's better to have something like that as parent report. You can also use it as an interview format to get some information to fill in the gaps when you can't observe in a familiar setting with familiar people and familiar things. So sometimes we rely on interview to help fill in some of the gaps. I'm going to skip some of this quickly, but there is some assessment standards out there, and Dr. Pretty Franzek actually was co-author on this resource, this book, that actually evaluates all the authentic assessments out there according to a rubric. And so you can compare a DAISY to a Creative Curriculum Gold to an Ages and Stages, even if they have different, even if they're designed for different purposes and functions, they're included in the linking book.
I have that if anyone wants to see it.
The linking book, okay, yeah.
If anyone wants to see it, let me know and I can share it with them.
So the reality is every one of these little circles is supposed to be a little child. And what this is supposed to show is that it's not as straightforward as a tier 1 child, a tier 2 child, and a tier 3 child. Every person has tier 1 or areas that they are doing just fine with common outcomes, tier 2 or areas where they need some additional support that's targeted, and tier 3 where we need some intense individualized support to reach those outcomes. And I say that this is not just about children. We could apply this to our spouses, our parents, our siblings, our friends at work. My funnest game these days is thinking about a functional behavior assessment in every setting that I'm in. And so, but for this purpose of this, we are thinking about this idea of this tiered information, and these are our definitions. So tier 1, common outcomes that are basically developmentally set. So it's about developmental sequences, or it can be about pedagogical sequences once we get to that point. So when we talk about moving to literacy skills in preschool, kindergarten, and above, those are pedagogical outcomes, but it's basically what our expectation is for that age of child, whatever that age might be, or that grade level. And then we move up to targeted, and then up to individualized. In this model, funding streams don't necessarily have anything to do with these tiers. So it is not that the only way I have individual outcomes or get individualized service at tier 3 is if I qualify for special education. Another example I use for individual outcomes is if you think about English language learners, and they, depending on their response and depending on their experiences, they might be in that tier 3 getting highly individualized language supports with lots of visuals and lots of extra vocabulary support for a year, but then they're going to come back down. It just depends. We were at a presentation last week where a little girl from, she was from the Middle East, and she was presenting as a sophomore for the Iowa STEM conference, and she had only been an English speaker this was her 3rd year. And she presented to 200 educators and business people at the Iowa STEM conference last Friday. That child got some really amazing tier 3 support when she ended up in her first school system in the United States. For her to be able to have that level of mastery of the English language and present pretty complex topics to the adults in the room. So one of the activities that you're going to have is going to be this idea of taking the information you have, including interest and preferences and information from families, and initially starting to think about where is the individual child, where are they hanging out and meeting tier 1 outcomes? Where are they doing okay developmentally? It might be motor, it might be cognitively, it might be in language, it might be in ability to build a relationship. Where are they doing okay with tier 1? When am I starting to see some things that I am thinking that they are going to need some additional assistance, and we're going to have a definition for tier 2? And then are there any areas of their development or pedagogical growth or that really are going to jump out and be tier 3? Tier 1 and tier 3 are really easy. Tier 2 becomes this kind of a little bit more challenging to try to figure out. And in fact, there's some theory that if we were able to have highly engaging, differentiated responses for all children, we may not even have tier 2. We'd have tier 1 and tier 3. So if you could think about if you could do in home settings, if every kid was able to get what they needed in just the right amount of time, we may not see tier 2. In school settings, if we could get to high engagement with differentiation of materials and flexible grouping, we might not need tier 2. But right now, it's that kind of, it's targeted, but it doesn't necessarily need to be so intense or as individualized. So
I feel like a lot of times when we do tier 2, it's I hate to even say this, but not a waste of time, but I feel like it's just like a hurdle I have to jump. And it's kind of frustrating because you give them all like, a nice classroom environment, and then you have to do all of these hoops and hurdles to even get to the third tier.
And when you say that, is that because the 3rd tier is title support?
No, actually, usually they're getting title support in tier 1. Because what we do at the beginning of the year is we do the readiness assessment, and any children that are considered at risk at that first assessment, they get put into title services. So then we just fill out we have to fill out the RTI form for tier 1 for them then. And then tier 2 is when we get all of these, interventions to do and usually the school psychologist and everybody meets in in that team, and they're like, okay, what do you see they need most? And then we go through that, and these are most of the time I've already started these interventions with them because I know what they need and I'm already doing it. Well, then they want 8 more weeks of intervention. Well, they see even a little bit of growth, then we do another 8 weeks of intervention. So it's just kind of this continuous cycle that the classroom teachers are typically already doing, but it has to be approved by the team.
Wow. That sounds to me like is it like a school assistance team? Is it like a SAT team? What's the name of that team?
It's like the RTI team.
The RTI team.
Yeah.
That's a real interesting response for tier 2.
Yeah.
Because generally, at what point are they looking at the data to figure out that the gains are on a trend line, they're going to get them back down to tier 1?
Mm-hmm. Well, the one thing that when we don't always meet for the tier 1, we don't always meet. We put in the form, and if the child is making adequate growth, the team does not meet. The only time that we meet is if with the interventions that we're doing in the classroom, if they are not responding to them, then we meet for that tier 2. And that's when they give us these, certain interventions that they want us to do.
See, that sounds to me like, Danielle, that you're already to tier 3.
Yes, exactly.
Title is usually not considered a tier 1. So there's a couple different things, and I don't want to frustrate you.
No, that's okay. I feel like if I come to the team and I have, maybe more background knowledge and I say, hey, this is how, it looks in other places, they would be open to maybe,
Yeah, and what I might do is give you some additional like 3 supports for interpreting that MTSS, because title in Iowa would not be considered tier 1. Tier 1, now I'm going to switch back over to Christy's definition of tier 1. But even tier 1 in an RTI model, it's what everybody gets.
Yeah.
So already title is extra. So just the fact that it's extra time, extra instruction, repeated, something different, that moves it from tier 1, unless it is, because title in Iowa wouldn't be considered a differentiation strategy. It would be an extra dosage.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing with us is that we're a kindergarten preschool building, and what would the title teacher be doing if we didn't give her students at the beginning of the year? Do you know what I'm saying?
Pushing in and helping you to group?
Yeah, I would like that. I don't know if she would like that so much because I actually pushed for that, but it didn't.
Yeah, title should be pushing in. Anyway, okay.
Yeah.
So let's go back to this.
Sorry.
Put in front of your preschool teachers and your kindergarten teachers. But I do want you to understand this, and this is not just a hot topic that's happening between Atlantic and Kent right now. This is nationally, these are the conversations that are happening, and people are struggling.
Okay.
People are struggling. But so in this model, tier 1 are the common outcomes. So think early learning standards. Think your developmental goals and outcomes that we looked at. Think ages and stages. Think GOLD. These are the state or agency standards, the developmentally appropriate milestones, knowledge, and skills, items from an assessment that links to curriculum. So curriculum-based assessment or linked assessment, like GOLD or APS. Okay, it's linked back to, here's your information, this is what you do differently or to support this general-based outcome the next day. Okay, Common Core or the big ideas. So that's your tier 1 scope. It's what I can plan within the absence of any assessment. This is what I plan for. Okay, so some ideas that it'd be in kindergarten. It could be your the Common Core outcomes. In preschool in Iowa, 2 things are driving this right now. 100% of our 4-year-olds were purchased and given and expected to implement GOLD with fidelity. And then we have the Iowa Early Learning Standards. I will tell you that once they said you will do GOLD, that trumped the Iowa Early Learning Standards. So teachers don't use both. If you ask them what are their outcomes that they have to work towards, they're going to say the GOLD assessment. Now, the good thing is, there's 70 outcomes on it, and it aligns with the Iowa Early Learning Standards. The bad thing is assessments don't measure everything that we think is important, nor do they define everything that we should probably be teaching. So that's why it's linked to a curriculum. It's what everyone's expected to learn. It's universal, which means it's developmentally and culturally relevant, and it covers all the body parts and all the learning. That's tier 1. Okay? I am not going to get into the big ideas tonight, but Christy is one of the authors of the big ideas. I am going to share next week some samples of the big ideas. If you like this way of thinking, where you move past discrete content skills, it makes tons of sense. I personally love it, but right now it's something that we don't necessarily need immediately to help us think about this sorting activity for children. So tier 2 is when one of two things has happened. Either you have kind of a multifaceted tier 1 outcome. So think if I'm measuring math in preschool and I need one-to-one, number naming, rote counting, all as components that I think are important. Maybe I've got the rote counting and the number naming, but I just can't get the one-to-one. Okay, I'm missing one piece. The example here is and this is a big idea about understanding function. Children can understand function of objects, function of roles, grandma, police officer, function of rules, and function of social norms. They may have objects, role, and rules, but not be able to understand function of social norms. So they don't understand initiating play. They don't understand watching for somebody else's response. They understand how to use scissors. They understand the various roles. They even can, to some extent, understand the rules, but it's just that social norms that trips them up. So one way you can get to tier 2 is to have a component skill missing. But the thing that I think are so important, and these are the categories, these dimensions of behavior are what I almost always see as the barriers to tier 1. So I don't have quality. Yeah, I can write my name, but for whatever reason, I'm not doing it with any quality. Either it's the pressure I'm applying or I'm doing fragmented sentence pieces. What I find with writing and quality is it could be hand strength, but it could be experience, but it also might be sensory. So something's getting in the way. I just don't do it as well as others. It could be accuracy. It could be the amount of time. I've told you about the little boy that it's just taken him forever to get from the door to the cubby to the bathroom back to the circle time. So we thought if we really focused on the time it took, we might be able to improve access to circle time. But what we found is the reason it was taking him so long is drop all the way down because everything was grabbing his attention. So these are the things that we find head you into tier 2 really quickly. I can't sustain. I don't have perseverance. I don't have executive functioning. Some of these things, when severe enough, pop you into tier 3. So executive functioning, I mean, all of them can, but these are the conversations that we're starting to have in our classrooms about the things that are getting in the way for participation and engagement. The other thing with these that are kind of, it's harder to pull this out of assessment information. So if it is initiation, you almost have to be so familiar with your assessment tool, you go back and see where did he fall apart every time it said initiate versus model or respond. And then tier 3, like I said, tier 3 is not so hard. And in fact, in Iowa, we say tier 3 is not necessarily that you qualify, but many times these are skill sets that the foundational skills are missing, and we've decided that there is some type of discrepancy. So a lot of times we'll see like these examples. A 4-year-old should be using sentences, but they're only using gestures or maybe initial sounds. They aren't able to sustain joint attention. Or again, that example I gave of if it's a child that's learning English, it's really a barrier to them being able to access that tier 1. And it's really clear. It's language, it's behavior. It's like this, we know without a doubt what that child needs to be able to access tier 1. Tier 3, the thing that's different is it's highly individualized. So usually the dosage looks like a child getting one-on-one or very small group support. It can be embedded in the day. We really start to think about multiple opportunities across the day, either in a home setting or a school setting, as opposed to tier 2. Generally, we're looking at additional dosage across the week. Tier 3, we're looking at additional dosage whenever we can get it. Christy said to some teachers the other day, this is what we're talking about. We need 10,000 trials a day. You know, I mean, you about can't prompt enough and set up enough opportunities for these kids to have the experiences that they need. These can be IEP worthy, and they require intensive instruction to acquire. So see, Danielle, that's pretty different than what.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then what happens is the individualized instruction, along with the progress monitoring, follow these. So, you know, the Kent State does that IEP training. Is it meaningful, functional, and legally defensible in the summertime? And what makes something IEP goal worthy? Writing quality goals is a whole skill set that requires people to really dig in and understand what are the barriers, what is the disability actually driving as far as the need, how do we truly get access and participation and progress. Generally, we're looking at these discrepancies over a year's time. So the note is a tier 2 outcome may be IEP goal worthy. Any IEP goal must be meaningful to the family, and all IEPs need to align to the PLEF and the goals. But really, in real world, we see tier 3, that these conversations happen pretty quickly as we're determining what a tier 3 intervention looks like. We're doing these kind of simultaneously, even though we're not supposed to be. In some models in Iowa, they drew a little dotted line at the top of the pyramid and said there's another decision-making process that happens to think about IEPs, but it's very similar as far as the amount and the immediacy and the intensity of the response. Kimberly, is there anything that you want to add to that?
No, the only piece I was thinking about, it also adds to the intensity of the assessment and review, that monitoring.
I think I'm going to, I want to get down. This is just kind of a review that when we think about sequences, the way that we define sequences is basically the way that we've approached this class. So we're not necessarily thinking about one particular sequence within a content area, although that could fall under pedagogical, but we have these developmental sequences, lots of developmental sequences identified out there for us by varied, reputable sources, agreed upon order in which children learn, and the pedagogical sequences where basically there needs to be some type of support, instruction. I always generally talk about pedagogical with when we move from language to literacy, when we move from an awareness of an amount to actually understanding number names and rote counting. Basically, pedagogical sequences are all those things that are housed under content labels. And then logical sequences, what makes sense given the situation, context, and priorities. And a lot of times with tier 2 and tier 3, not always, but we can see a breakdown in any of these sequences, but the older the child gets, before we start to see a barrier, a lot of times for us, it pops up with when we start to introduce pedagogical sequences. But I don't know, I'm thinking about home-based. For tier 2 and tier 3, it's funny because we had this conversation this morning and the school psych said to me, but if he was 2 and qualifying for early access, what all intervention data would we need? I said, well, that's a whole different world because we don't have that model as of yet pushed into that birth to 3 realm. So we rely more on discrepancy data in Iowa. In our birth to 3, we don't have that intervention part in place. The intervention is in place when we're trying to make growth and make gain.
Yeah, I think that's true nationally for Part C early intervention, that it's a discrepancy model. Children qualify based on their present levels of performance, based on some sort of tool or measurement. And if they meet those standards, then they go forward in service.
So if we think about a tier 1 outcome of participation, and we start to think about defining what does participation look like in the classroom, and these are conversations I have when I'm in classrooms talking through with teachers. So what are your expectations for participation at large group, at small group, and one-on-one, during routine times, child-directed times, or planned activities, and with verbal reminders with full supports, and or with visual cues. Now, what's interesting is I can interview 20 different 4-year-old teachers and get 20 different responses to what their expectation and their widely held opinion is on what participation should look like with verbal reminders, full support, and visual cues. Some of my 4-year-old teachers would never think about raising an eyebrow if they have all those things in place all the time. Another teacher, I can say, you really have to put visual supports in for this child at tier 1 for full participation. And they say, you mean he's special ed? Like, nope, I just mean you need visuals in place for this child. That's how we're going to define participation. This I'm going to hold off on because this comes up for next week. And I want to see if I can get, this is almost done, but I want to also show you guys the sorting triangles then. So Christy ended with this idea of fear of weakness overshadows our confidence in our strengths. Identify the strengths of yourself, the strengths of the children, the families, the communities, and fully realize them. So what we have to do is think about, whoops, I think I want to do this one first. Nope, sorry. This one first. With the information we have from Sit Beside and Get to Know, preferences and interests, and gifts and contributions, with the child that you have selected, initially what you're going to do is just think about across the body parts, where are they as far as tier 1, that they're meeting tier 1 expectations. Do you see any areas that have stalled, or we go back to some of those indicators, attention, perseverance, preference, latency, joint attention, behavior, anything that is getting in the way of them being able to access the common standards, the general curriculum, show growth on the developmental milestones, or at their age or grade level expectations. Those would be tier 2 identified needs. And do they have anything that is really a foundational missing component that is going to require a longer duration, a higher intensity, and individualization for them to be able to access participation and engagement. So initially, you're going to take your child and take your information that you have and just start to come up with kind of an idea or a representation of what's going pretty well, where might be some areas that are stalled, and where might be some areas that are actually missing. Behavior ends up hanging out in tier 2 and tier 3, and kind of the intensity, the duration of the behavior, distinguish it between a tier 2 behavior need and a tier 3 behavior need. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look here and see. I'm going to hold off on this one until I give you, because this is actually when you connect it to an intervention plan. So I'm going to hold off on that until next week. And I also put in sorry, I'm popping around in here, an additional reading to chapter 7 that will help to make some sense with this. Right now, you don't have to go out and administer any different assessments. If you don't have any information and you want to use the Ages and Stages or the Ages and Stages SC, just to start, like I said, another good practice is just sit beside and get to know, talk to families. The second part of that is, especially if you're working with a child that's already receiving services, either in a home or in a center setting, I want you to find out what assessment information they already have. What's already been documented and gathered around the child needs. And Kim, you might be able to speak to that, like thinking about the child that you're working with, they're already receiving early access services.
Early intervention?
Early intervention.
Well, the one child I chose is not.
Okay.
It was a child that I have worked with before on a project for the evaluation and assessment course. So I already had a pretty good foundation. We had to do the tier in the evaluation and assessment course as well. We had to go through, pick a norm reference tool and a standardized. We had to do that piece, and then we had to do a curriculum referenced. So we had to kind of do 2 different tools, and then we had to kind of come up with where does that child fall in his level of needs. And we did something similar to this sorting process you're doing. So the child I picked, I I was trying to avoid those kids I know that are in EI just because I have a different relationship with them. So I was trying to pick a friend who has a young child. He's had some medical issues, but he's not receiving services. His delays are not significant enough. They're more related to medical and his need to pick up. So I'm going to help mom identify strategies and techniques.
Okay, good.
But he's not significant enough to warrant EI.
So you might come up with some tier 2 supports for him. I mean, it might even look like a tier 3 outcome, but possibly not. And that's the other thing that I want to say is not all children have needs across these tiers. Mm-hmm. I've never worked with a child that I couldn't come up with some tier 1 outcome where they were able to engage and participate.
Right. The other thing, Pam, I think is important to think about too is when I'm thinking about early intervention and I think about this and as I reflect back, it's also based on the family's desire for the behavior to change or that the child's skills to grow. And so I always kind of step back and look at what are the family goals and then aligning that to where should that child be, and then kind of using that to guide the family's engagement or interaction, and then look at those naturally occurring learning opportunities, kind of all of Dunstan Bruder's information, really looking at what is the child like, what does their day look like, and how can we find natural opportunities based on child interest, based on family interest, to then maybe move some things to 2-tier based on all of that kind of information.
Yeah, and that could be your dissertation, because this idea of meshing this RTI approach with family-centered outcomes, and like I said, in birth to 3, we're not feeling the pressure in Iowa. But we still do need to think about how do we link up with instructional strategies? What's the dosage of the instructional strategies? What's the intensity of the instructional strategies? So it's still, I think it's a helpful model, but you're right. In birth to 3, and in Iowa too, we're really digging in and understanding that coaching and family-based outcomes, sometimes it's a dilemma. Mm-hmm. You know, I had an early interventionist say to me, you know, we really have language things that we need to be working on. But what the mom's goal is for the child to sustain play with toys, because basically she wants her to sit and be quiet while she's trying to get some things done. And she goes, it's a tier 3 need for language.
Right. So then it's that balance between how do you build from where the family's at, how do you use play, how do you help them understand how language is part of play, how your communication will help your child stay engaged in that activity longer. So you have to kind of shift, but we also have to shift our thinking and our judgment too. And so, you know, we have to look at family perspective in their life to say that mom might be just completely exhausted and 20 minutes of her kid playing would make her a better parent.
Well, and that's the other thing, you know, we're not going to get, yes, we have to build those relationships if we are going to be able to think about multiple opportunities in a family. I mean, for some of these families, we've got to figure out how to build those capacities and honor what they bring to the table. So I totally agree. Yeah. But it's definitely a different way of thinking. Mm-hmm. When you go through this type of process and then do an overlay, that would actually be interesting then, is in at another point to do an overlay with family preferences. Mm-hmm. And negotiate how do we fine tune this so that we can honor those family preferences, but recognize that, yeah, we definitely, as the developmentalist, understand where some of those delays are, some of the barriers, and some of those significant gaps. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell Christy that she just needs to come up with that overlay. You tell her that we talked, and I said all we need is an overlay with family-centered practices on top of the pyramid and the instructional sequence, and we're set. We can present someplace.
And Kim will do that for you.
Kim will do that. Kim will do the overlay. All right, guys, I have kept you longer than I intended. You'll see that I put all these supports into the website. It's just my intent right now that you think about authentic assessment, sip aside, get to know, what do you have access to? Do you have information across all the body parts? The gold is out there if you know AAPS, or if you've already used AAPS in the assessment course, by all means double dip in this course. That's absolutely encouraged to think about those assessment practices that you've already put in place. I'm going to send out some samples of past work with this. They're not necessarily exemplars, but because every kid is so individualized. And I'm also going to create a couple of these with some 3- and 4-year-olds that I'm working with right now. One, because I'd love some feedback, so I can try to figure some things out with these kids that I'm working with. So we are together next week for presentations again. So I will also be just clarifying that, because I think we need to try to get through 4. So, okay?
Can I ask you a quick question about this assignment?
Sure.
Okay. The one thing I was looking at is there certain assessments that we should be using? Because I have a lot of assessment, but some of it is like district developed. And I don't know if I should use other assessments on this.
Okay, I don't want to add to your load right now.
Okay.
My perception is district developed assessments aren't generally that useful unless you're talking about analyzing running records or writing samples or that type of thing. Tell me a little bit about here, I'm going to stop recording. Well, no, I guess I could record this in case. Tell me a little bit about what the child that you've picked.
He is a little boy that came to me in November, and he's a little bit tricky because he's got like really stellar phonemic awareness, but he cannot remember letters for the life of him. He is one of those kids that like I started off with the letters in his name, and every time like I show him a letter, he'll go B-R-A, that's why. He has to like go through his name in order to know the letter. And then I would start doing, then after he learned his name pretty well, like with, and randomly, then we started doing the alphabet, and I started with, since he's really linear, I started A, B, C, D, and we did that, and he has to go back through it. So that's who like I'm working with him right now.
So does he do, how's he do with number naming?
Number naming, he actually does pretty well. The only thing I can't get him, he gets so mixed up with that 13, 14, 15. He's like sometimes skips some.
How's he do with recall retell activities?
He actually does pretty well with that. As long as he has picture, as long as there's a picture.
Pictures.
Reinforcement, so, and if like I ask him questions during a story, as long as the picture is still up, he's able to talk about that.
How's he do with sequencing the daily routine without pictures?
Not so well.
Okay.
He has a hard time with that. He has a hard time with like remembering things. So even though my day looks exactly the same every single day, if I don't have the pictures up there, he'll go, what's next? What are we doing next? What's going on?
Short-term memory, executive functioning.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. But I'm also thinking like just through that conversation, my tier 2 for him would be thinking, and I don't know him, but I'm just, I'm really getting good at throwing darts at targets these days and saying, we'll try it. It might work. But I'm thinking, right away, recall, retell, moving from with visuals to with prompts, with verbal, like that would right away, like bam, that's a tier 2 need for me.
Okay.
Like if it's anytime a kid has this inconsistency with these naming, because the other place I go is it visual discrimination? Do they need more tactile experience with these letters? But before I ever even go there, I go right to recall, retell. And and executive functioning is, that certs, that I posted, the part of the certs that I posted, trying to remember if it has all of that stuff in it. I just ordered that whole book. I had it, but I think it was Christy's, and I think she took it back. What are you thinking, Kim, as far as executive functioning supports?
Yeah, and my brain's like going, zzz, like I'm thinking of all kinds of different things. And I don't know what have you tried? Because I think that's where we really have to start. What have you tried?
Like I said, the interventions that I'm doing with him are mostly on, I'm doing a lot of tactile objects, like we've done like sandpaper letters, those kind of things. And I've also done a lot of that, linear, like being able him to kind of go through it in his brain and like get him familiar that way. And then, mixing it up, that kind of.
So he has to hold it in his working memory longer.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes.
So.
More
frequent, shorter bursts.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's usually I only can keep him. He's has a very short attention span, so I only can keep him for about 3 to 4 minutes. So I'm doing that 3 times a day.
So his attention?
Oh, attention is definitely. He's one of those little hand, like on the carpet. He's the one that is playing with his hands.
Okay, so do you have because do you have iPads or apps?
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's what we did last week with one of my little guys. And I don't know if it's going to work forever, but the attention was such an issue, as well as sensory and fetal alcohol and you name it, this poor kid. Mm-hmm. But I put headphones on him.
Okay.
It wasn't an app, but you could do it with an app. It was a electronic book reader with these headphones attached, and there was cause and effect with it. So he had to touch something, and then it would give a response. But so the headphones allowed him to maintain focus on it, and the cause and effect was enough to keep him engaged with it. And so here's what I said to the teacher. If we can get him to sustain attention, and we can get him to work on some of this content, and we can increase that burst, but get him to keep with it, we can at least determine if multiple exposures is going to help him to recall, retain.
Okay.
Aside from that, building that capacity for work, I mean, and does he have any history that you know of that he's coming to you with?
Not that I know of. I've tried many, many times to get mom to either come in or even have a conversation with me, and she's very avoidant. She doesn't want to talk to me.
She's not ready to hear what you have to tell her because she knows what you're going to say.
Yeah, and she was already at another district, and I don't know if that's the reason that she moved or,
And he's a kindergartner?
He is a kindergartner, yep.
And he hasn't been referred for any sort of OT assessment or... He
is art and fine motor. He does very well.
So you don't see any sensory stuff?
And the same thing. I haven't seen any, sensory issues so far, but.
When he gets distracted, when you're working with him with letters or numbers, is it distracted because there's something in the environment, or is it distracted because you think the cognition, the task is too hard?
The second, yeah.
The task is too difficult.
Yeah.
So do you have a good feel where you think he is? Like, where is he functioning right now?
Yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I'm confused by him a little bit because
here's the other thing that happens is what I see with my teachers is they end up accommodating at such high levels. Mm-hmm. That when I walk in, I'm like, okay, you realize that you're using visuals and proximity and verbal for every transition, for every task completion, for every and I love you for doing all of that, but we just need to start to think about what all supports are pouring in, mm-hmm. so that we can start to figure out how do we have some gradual release, or where do we establish the threshold and the tolerance, So I would assume by just knowing you that that's probably what your day, you probably aren't even aware of.
Oh, absolutely. Everything that you say, I do for him, or I help him or coach him into doing it,
Okay, let me think about this. I've got some ideas. And Kimberly, if you have anything on that executive function or working memory,
Yeah, so I was trying to rule out like what other sensory things might be going on. So if you really think it's not sensory, but in fact it's his attention and that working memory piece, that executive functioning, then our approach is a little different.
Yeah, well, Kim, can you explain to me how it looks differently? Like, what would you say is sensory versus?
Okay, so a child who is so highly distracted by the environmental noise or movement. So remember that sensory processing can impact one or all of the senses.
Yeah.
So some children, they hear too much. And so we want to put headphones on to help them eliminate sounds around them. Or for a child who has visual stimulation kind of gets them out, we want to put a barrier for a little while. We're going to try to work them back out of that barrier, but we're going to try to put a barrier to have them focus on tasks. Mm-hmm. So we look at that a little differently. We need to work on sensory to then increase attention. Versus, and it could be multiple, we have kids that look all over the place, versus a child whose thinking and problem solving and recall are based on their cognitive ability or that processing in the mind of the information you've shared with them to say, what was that? So you approach that differently than what's the main root behind this child not being able to pay attention.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it helps.
Okay, because some kids might have both.
If it becomes if the task is too challenging, and I shut down or avoid it or turn away, it can look like I'm distracted by sound, sight, smells, whatever. But you do have to start to figure out when is that moment, and if it's that cognitive challenge, then we got to back up, scaffold that. But then it becomes kind of more straightforward, because if we just are focusing on that, building that capacity for working memory, it helps give you clarity on to define where he's at and how to continue to build that.
Mm-hmm. You're going to do a lot of cycling up and cycling down. That's scaffolding. You're going to go up and down, have them constantly practicing. Start where he's at. Build on where he presently is. That gives him confidence and competence. And then you build up and then you bring him down. You're going to cycle up and down, up and down. That's where people make the mistake. They try to go one step up from where they currently are, and the child's lost confidence. We want to get them feeling successful, even if it's with one letter, like you've kind of done with his name.
Yeah.
Focus on that real functional, and then build up.
And I would say, there is some really cool stuff happening out there with apps as far as the dosage. It's not to replace that feedback loop within a person, but it's engaging for some kids. And it maintains that cause and effect, because I got to do something. I got to touch something. I've got to push something. So it maintains that. And a lot of them have corrective feedback built in. So that, like right now, the one I've been using is this. It's kind of a concepts one, and it's called Monkey Lunchbox. It's like $1.99, and it's this. But you can watch the kids do it and quickly figure out. And it's really more of like a real young 3. But I was watching because it has like puzzles. It's got that pick which one. It's kind of like, so it's got that, where you flip upside down and there's 6 cards upside down and there's 2 pineapples in there. They got to go back and figure out which one's the 2 pineapples. I mean, I've been telling some of my teachers that idea of increasing dosage with apps for some kids, when we get a goodness of fit with what the activity in the app is, and we think is that extra support that they need, we're seeing some real success with it. and I always say not to replace that scaffolding and that prompting and all of those things, but it can engage and sustain and start to work on some of these skills after you walk away.
Yes.
But let me think about some other things with that, and get some other stuff for that executive functioning for you.
Oh, thank you.
The scary thing is almost always I've literally gotten, last time I talked to you I had 7 little boys. Well, as of today I have 9. And with all 9 kids I've got a background story that explains it, or at least contributes to it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So,
I'm sure there's something obviously underlying there
yeah.
that she's avoiding.
Yeah. And I mean, and we don't ever recommend beds, but I've got 2 of them that I'm like, yeah, that might end up be where there's just some stuff going on,
Mhm. Yeah.
Drugs were probably the root of the evil, and now probably is going to be what we have to rely on to regain some supports for 2 of them. But yeah, there's some stuff. I mean, and so you just can't, you got to not get overwhelmed with what you don't have control over.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so class, that was exactly how you moved from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, back down to tier 2, back up to tier 3, and she's more confused than when she started. That's exactly how this is supposed to work.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys.
Have a good night.
Bye.